Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin with Story 1, where monks became medics. You walk through the cold stone corridor of a great abbey, the scent of beeswax and herbs thick in the air. It is the year 1050, and you are entering the famed monastic infirmary of Cluny Abbey in Burgundy. The air is quiet not due to a lack of life, but because of a choice. Silence is sacred here, second only to prayer. The Benedictine monks who live and work in these walls do so under the rule of Saint Benedict, which demands humility, discipline, and above all, service to others. But this is no ordinary monastery. Cluny is the heart of a reform movement that has spread through Christendom like the morning bells, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. Its influence, both spiritual and practical, stretches across Europe, and one of its lesser-known legacies is its contribution to medieval healthcare. The infirmary at Cluny was more than a sick bay, it was a crucible of Christian charity, a model of structured, organized medical care centuries before modern hospitals. To understand its significance, you must strip away the assumptions of modern medicine and enter the mindset of an age where illness was as much a spiritual crisis as a physical one. A world without doctors as you know them. In the 11th century, doctor was not yet a profession most people would encounter. Instead, the sick turned to monks, nuns, or local wise women. Healing was as much a moral act as a practical one. Disease was believed to be sent by God as punishment or as a trial of faith. Monks, especially those at Cluny, were ideally suited to take on the role of healers. They were literate, disciplined, and devoted. They had access to ancient texts, rudimentary surgical instruments, and most importantly, time. Time to care, time to observe, time to listen. At Cluny, the infirmary wasn't a side building but an essential part of the abbey's architecture. It stood apart from the main cloisters, its long windows letting in light from the east. A patient, be he monk or pauper, would lie on a straw mattress, perhaps beneath a simple woolen blanket. By today's standards, it was meager, but by medieval standards, it was revolutionary. Inside the infirmary, the monastic infirmary was more structured than the chaos of battlefield tents or peasant homes. There was routine. A monk assigned to the infirmarius role would oversee the needs of the sick, preparing herbal remedies, administering prayers, and keeping vigil at night. Herbs were grown in dedicated gardens just outside the infirmary. Feverfew, sage, yarrow, wormwood plants whose Latin names were copied and recopied into medical books kept under lock in the scriptorium. These weren't folk remedies scrawled on parchment in some superstition-laden hut. These were carefully studied treatments, handed down from Roman texts like Dioscorides de Materia Medica, often through Arabic intermediaries. Food was part of the healing process, too. A special diet was prepared for the infirm, including fish, eggs, and goat's milk, foods that were otherwise restricted during fasting. Healing, after all, was a matter of balance. Between body and soul, between sin and penance, between divine will and earthly intervention. But not everyone who entered Cluny's infirmary was a monk. Hospitality was sacred, and the monastery often opened its gates to pilgrims and travelers in need. Some came seeking cures they believed could only come through the touch of a saint's relic or the prayers of holy men. Others, simply, had nowhere else to go. Care in the cloister. Monastic care was slow, patient, and spiritual. There were no quick fixes. The monks observed symptoms carefully, documented progress when possible, and tried to restore health through rest, prayer, and gentle remedies. The patient's spiritual condition was just as important. Confession was often part of the healing process. The idea was not just to treat the ailment but to prepare the soul either for recovery or for death. Either outcome was accepted with equal humility. Monks read aloud to the sick from scripture and the lives of the saints. This wasn't just for comfort, it was believed to have a healing effect. The spoken word, especially when sacred, was thought to carry divine power. Psalms were chanted softly at the bedside, and candles were lit to bring divine light into dark hours. There were no scalpels, no syringes, no antibiotics, yet there was care, there was structure, and there was peace. The rule of silence. In the infirmary, the monks maintained near total silence. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized speaking only when necessary, especially in sacred spaces. Gestures and subtle signs replaced loud words. This quietude, far from being oppressive, created a sense of solemnity. For the sick, it brought stillness. For the dying, dignity. One might imagine a monk in his final days lying in his infirmary bed, the faint scent of rosemary on his pillow, a single candle flickering near the window. The silence allows him to reflect, to pray, to prepare. In this setting, death is not feared, it is faced. A model for Europe. What made Cluny's infirmary special wasn't just its internal discipline but its influence. Other monasteries copied its structure and ethos. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, as Cluniac reform spread, so too did the idea that monasteries had a duty not just to pray but to heal. Monks from Cluny traveled to other parts of France, to Germany, to England. They took with them not only their liturgical practices, but their attitudes toward caregiving. The infirmary model was replicated again and again, slowly evolving into more complex institutions. In time, these early monastic infirmaries would form the blueprint for the first hospitals, in the modern sense a term that comes from the Latin hosps, meaning guest or host. Not doctor, not medicine, but hospitality. A place to be received, cared for, and if it must be allowed to pass on with grace. Unanswered questions in the shadows. And yet, we are left with questions. What happened to the laypeople who passed through the gates of Cluny's care? Did the monks' rigid routines serve all patients equally? How did their practices compare to the healing work being done in Islamic hospitals far to the east? Most records speak of the monks themselves, but the poor and sick who came for help left fewer traces. Their stories lie quietly between the pages, half told, often overlooked. As Cluny's bells rang across Burgundy in the 11th and 12th centuries, their reverberations were not just spiritual, they carried with them a quiet but enduring transformation in the way medieval Europe viewed illness, care, and the sacred duty of hospitality. The infirmary at Cluny had become more than a wing of a monastic complex. It was a concept, a model, an idea that would spread through monastic and civic life alike. If Section 1 brought us inside Cluny's infirmary to observe its daily rhythms and sacred silences, Section 2 takes us outward, tracing the influence of Cluniac ideas across Europe and into the hearts of new communities, new monasteries, and new hospitals. It is a story of transmission, not just of doctrine, but of compassion codified into routine. The Cluniac network and its ripples. Cluny was not a solitary institution. By the peak of its influence in the 12th century, it controlled over 1,000 daughter houses, monasteries across France, Germany, Italy, and England that followed the Cluniac reforms. These abbeys shared more than liturgical practices. They shared architectural design, daily schedules, spiritual emphasis, and critically, their approach to infirmary care. Each new monastery was encouraged to build an infirmary modeled on Cluny's example, complete with herb gardens, separate quarters, and assigned roles. The infirmarius, the monk in charge of healthcare, was a formal appointment, often granted to older, experienced monks who had both practical wisdom and spiritual maturity. Monasteries such as La Charité-sur-Loire in France or Lewes Priory in England replicated this model faithfully. Even as political landscapes shifted and wars disrupted life, this network of monastic care quietly continued, tending to the sick and the poor in a time before state-run healthcare or professional physicians were widely accessible. Hospitals for the poor, the Christian duty. The idea that caring for the sick was an act of piety wasn't unique to Cluny, but the Cluniac movement standardized and systematized it in new ways. In the Rule of Saint Benedict, chapter 36 reads, "Care of the sick must rank above and before all else." Cluny's monks took this seriously, building not only for themselves, but creating a cultural expectation that monasteries should be places of healing. Outside the cloister walls, new institutions began to appear. These weren't monastic infirmaries per se, but something new: hospitia, places of welcome that eventually evolved into hospitals. Many were founded by noble families or civic authorities, but they often followed monastic principles in layout and practice. For example, the Hôtel Dieu of Lyon and later the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, established in the mid-12th century, were both deeply influenced by the monastic ethos. Rows of beds, overseen by religious caretakers, lined high-ceilinged halls. Patients were treated with a blend of herbal remedies and spiritual care. Death was frequent, but so too was dignity. Knowledge transmission and medical texts. Cluniac monks were among the few in Europe at the time with access to medical texts. The monastery's scriptorium did more than copy Bibles. It reproduced Latin translations of earlier Greek and Roman works, including those of Galen, Hippocrates, and Dioscorides. But here, another layer of influence enters the story. Many of these texts came to Europe through the Islamic world, where Arabic-speaking physicians had preserved and expanded upon classical medical knowledge. These works, translated into Latin in places like Salerno and Toledo, began to trickle into monastic libraries. While Cluny was not a center of translation itself, its monks read and recopied the fruits of these efforts. Thus, we find a paradox. A monastery devoted to silence and simplicity became a quiet hub for preserving ancient medical wisdom. The monks did not innovate so much as conserve, and in that conservation, they laid groundwork for future learning. Imagine a Cluniac monk in a dimly lit scriptorium, carefully tracing the words of Galen's humoral theory onto fresh parchment. He may not understand all the physiology described, but he knows it is worth saving. Roles and rituals of the infirmary. As the Cluniac model spread, so too did the specific roles and rituals associated with care. The infirmarius managed day-to-day operations of the infirmary. He was responsible for preparing remedies, arranging for confessions, and ensuring food and clean bedding were available. The herbarius maintained the medicinal garden. This monk worked in all seasons, harvesting and drying herbs for use in tinctures, poultices, and teas. The cellarer ensured the infirmary had supplies, sometimes even arranging for wine, which was used medicinally and ritually. Novices and lay brothers assisted in lifting patients, changing bandages, and performing the humbler tasks of care. Each morning began with prayer, followed by rounds through the infirmary. Patients were washed, beds made, and the morning remedy administered, be it a warm herbal infusion or a simple dose of honey and vinegar. In cases of severe illness, a priest might be summoned to administer the last rites. Death was neither denied nor hidden. It was accepted, even prepared for. The commendation of the dying, a ritual of prayer, song, and confession, helped ease the transition. Tensions and limitations. Despite their best efforts, monastic infirmaries like Cluny's were not immune to the biases and limitations of their time. Women, especially laywomen, were rarely treated unless they entered through female orders or separate convent hospitals. Non-Christians, particularly Jews and Muslims, were often excluded, despite the richness of medical traditions in their own communities. Moreover, the monks' rejection of surgery, a practice viewed as bodily mutilation, meant that certain treatments were left to barbers or secular practitioners. This created a split between the spiritual care offered by monks and the more practical, hands-on treatment found elsewhere. And while the Cluniacs emphasized humility and service, their monasteries grew wealthy over time. Some critics argued that their focus on liturgy and ceremony overshadowed their original charitable mission. This would later fuel reform movements like the Cistercians, who sought to strip monastic life of its excesses. Still, the care provided at Cluny and its daughter houses represented a sincere effort to weave health and healing into the fabric of faith. A glimpse into daily life. Let us return briefly to the infirmary itself. It is early autumn. A lay traveler has arrived, coughing and weak, having walked from a nearby village. The infirmarius greets him in silence, gestures him to a seat, and brings a bowl of warm wine infused with thyme. The traveler lies down on a cot in the southern wing, warmed by the sun. A novice washes his feet, while another monk prepares a linen cloth soaked in vinegar to reduce fever. Over the coming days, he receives both nourishment and quiet. No one asks for payment. No one demands proof of worth. There is simply care, slow, steady, and sacred. From monasteries to municipal hospitals. As urban centers began to grow in the 12th and 13th centuries, so did the need for public health care. While monasteries continued to play a role, new civic hospitals began to appear, often founded by guilds, city councils, or wealthy patrons. Yet many of these institutions were staffed by religious orders, and their layouts echoed the monastic infirmaries of Cluny. Beds were arranged in long halls with an altar at one end. Meals were simple but nutritious. Cleanliness, within the knowledge of the time, was prioritized. Infirmarians gave way to nurses, often from religious sisterhoods. This was the next phase in the story, the evolution of care from cloister to city. A legacy carried forward. By the end of the 12th century, Cluny's direct influence had begun to wane. Political and religious upheaval, the rise of rival monastic orders, and the centralization of papal power all contributed. But its contribution to healthcare endured. Infirmaries were no longer seen as optional additions, they were expected. Care was no longer a haphazard act of charity, but a structured, spiritual obligation. Even today, the language of care, hospitality, hospice, host, carries echoes of Cluny's sacred silence. And yet, how did the care given in a monastic infirmary compare to that in other traditions such as the Islamic Bimaristans of Baghdad or Cairo, where physicians practiced surgery and compiled encyclopedias of medicine? What was lost when healing became the exclusive domain of the church? And what happened when the plague came? The bells at Cluny once rang in perfect rhythm, regulating hours of prayer, labor, meals, and silence. But in the middle of the 14th century, the measured pace of monastic life shattered. The Black Death had arrived, and with it, an unrelenting, invisible force that tested not just the physical infrastructure of hospitals and infirmaries, but the very soul of Christian caregiving. For centuries, Cluny had offered a model of calm, quiet healing. It had cared for weary pilgrims and ailing brothers alike. But the plague was no ordinary illness. It did not follow the rules. It did not allow time for reflection or recovery. It surged through towns and monasteries alike with unsparing speed. The infirmary that had once echoed with whispered prayers now filled with the groans of the dying. The peaceful order of healing gave way to chaos. A world upended. The Black Death entered Europe in 1347, and within 3 years, it had killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. In monasteries, where monks lived in close quarters and often tended to the sick personally, mortality rates were even higher. Cluny's infirmary was no exception. Though its records are incomplete, We know that monastic communities were decimated, sometimes entire abbeys lost every single inhabitant. The infirmarius and his helpers, devoted as they were, could not keep up. The death toll rose too quickly. The herb gardens went untended, supplies dwindled, burial grounds overflowed. One can imagine the scene: a candle-lit infirmary overwhelmed with bodies, the quiet efficiency of previous decades replaced by desperation. Young monks suddenly thrust into roles of care they hadn't trained for, rituals condensed, prayers abbreviated, last rites delivered hurriedly if at all. Still, some stayed. Even when escape was possible, some monks remained, believing that to care for the dying, even at the cost of their own lives, was the ultimate act of faith. The limits of faith and medicine. The plague exposed the limitations of both theology and traditional remedies. The idea that illness was punishment for sin faltered in the face of mass death that spared neither sinner nor saint. The pious, the innocent, the devout all died alongside thieves and soldiers. The monks tried their best, burning aromatic herbs, fasting, praying, and purifying the air with incense. But nothing worked. Even the time-honored tools of the monastic infirmary, herbs, diet, silence, were powerless. Yet the collapse was not just medical. It was emotional, institutional, and spiritual. Monks questioned the fairness of divine will. Survivors were traumatized. The very institutions that had defined Christian care for centuries began to waver. Cluny itself, once the most powerful monastery in Europe, entered a period of decline during and after the plague years. Its population dwindled, its influence waned, and yet its legacy endured in new and unexpected ways. A legacy of structure amid collapse. The systems that Cluny had built, the separation of the sick, the specialized roles, the use of medicinal gardens, the emphasis on hygiene, proved adaptable. In other parts of Europe, especially in growing urban centers, civic leaders began to emulate and expand upon these ideas. Hospitals founded in the post-plague era often included features taken directly from monastic blueprints: long wards with ventilation, herb-based treatments, and a focus on both bodily and spiritual care. In cities like Siena, Florence, and Avignon, plague hospitals sprang up. Though often overwhelmed, they showed glimmers of the Cluniac method: organizing care, categorizing patients, and employing designated caretakers. Religious orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, which had taken inspiration from Cluniac discipline, stepped into the void, ministering to both body and soul. The idea that structured, compassionate care should be a constant even in the face of overwhelming loss was one of Cluny's quiet gifts to the future. Stories from the plague years. We hear whispers in the record's brief, dry lines in Latin of the monks who stood their ground. Brother Guillaume, who tended to the sick even as fever took him. Novice Bertrand, barely 16, carrying water to the infirmary until he could walk no more. These men did not leave behind treatises or sermons. Their legacy was quieter. And yet their actions echoed. Later chroniclers, writing in calmer centuries, remembered them not as martyrs or saints, but as examples of steadfast duty. They upheld, even in collapse, the idea that care was sacred even when it could not save. Beyond the plague, a changing world. After the Black Death, Europe changed. The feudal order began to unravel. Labor shortages gave peasants new power. Religious skepticism grew and monastic vocations declined. Cluny, once the jewel of Burgundy, began to fade into relative obscurity. Its lands were sold, its buildings fell into disrepair, and during the French Revolution its remaining stones were stripped for other uses. And yet the Cluniac ideal of ordered spiritual care did not die. It morphed. New hospitals, increasingly secular in tone, adopted the same principles: clean beds, structured roles, quiet dignity. Nursing orders, especially of women, took up the torch. Later still, universities would formalize medical training, but they did so standing on foundations laid in part by monks with no formal degrees but centuries of observation, record-keeping, and human contact. Even the language of hospitality survives in modern healthcare institutions, a faint echo of the abbey gates that once opened to strangers, lepers, and the dying. The final candle. Let us return one last time to that infirmary in Cluny. It is winter now. Snow gathers on the arched windows. A single monk, old and bent, makes his way between empty beds. The plague has passed, but so have many of his brothers. The silence feels heavier. He lights a candle beside the altar. Its glow is small, its warmth fragile. But it is not gone. This perhaps is the final lesson of Cluny's infirmary. Not triumph, not miracle, but endurance. The monks could not defeat disease, they could not escape death, but they could bear witness. They could hold hands, they could prepare a final meal, they could offer rest. Not always a cure, but always care. Reflections across time. In our modern hospitals, with their machines and digital records, it is easy to forget the roots. Easy to miss the long, slow evolution that brought order to chaos, compassion to systems, and dignity to death. But if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. In the quiet ward of a hospice, in the hand of a nurse adjusting a pillow, in the herbal scent of a warm compress placed on aching skin. The rhythm is slower now, quieter, but it is the same rhythm that once guided a monk through cold stone halls, bearing nothing but a candle and a bowl of broth. And perhaps in that silence, Cluny still lives. Story 2. Salerno's Healing Wisdom, the first medical school in Europe. You stand on a hillside above the Gulf of Salerno, the salty wind catching the folds of your cloak. It is the early 11th century, and down below, nestled between steep mountain slopes and shimmering sea, lies the city of Salerno, quiet, sunlit, and about to become the intellectual heart of medical learning in medieval Europe. Long before Paris or Bologna had universities, before physicians were licensed or anatomy understood, the people of Salerno were collecting, translating, and teaching the wisdom of healing. They called it the Schola Medica Salernitana. Not a university as we might imagine today, but rather a loose collection of scholars, monks, and physicians dedicated to the study of the human body and its ailments. Salerno became known as Hippocratica Civitas, the city of Hippocrates, not because it birthed new medical theories, but because it safeguarded and transmitted ancient ones. And more importantly, because it drew together 4 traditions of healing: Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Jewish into one multicultural dialogue. In a world fractured by war, faith, and ignorance, this quiet city became a rare meeting point of minds. Why Salerno? To understand why Salerno rose to prominence, you must understand its geography. Located in southern Italy, near the Amalfi coast, it sat at a crossroads of trade, pilgrimage, and conquest. It was close to the Mediterranean shipping routes that linked it with North Africa, Byzantium, and the Levant. It was protected by mountains yet open to the sea. And politically, it enjoyed relative independence during key periods of its development. More than once, this little city was conquered by Lombards, Normans, and later the Holy Roman Empire. But through all these changes, its commitment to medicine endured. Perhaps because no one power fully controlled it, Salerno remained intellectually open, drawing students and teachers from across the known world. The medical school emerges. The origins of the Schola Medica Salernitana are somewhat murky. Some traditions place its founding in the 9th century, others in the 10th. There are even legends that it began when 4 doctors, 1 Latin, 1 Greek, 1 Arab, and 1 Jewish met by chance under the arches of Salerno and decided to work together. Though the story is likely apocryphal, the symbolism is telling. Salerno's medical school was built not on isolation, but on synthesis. Unlike Cluny, which emphasized healing as a spiritual vocation, Salerno emphasized knowledge. It was not monastic. It was not even entirely religious. It was, in many ways, secular, practical, curious, empirical in its own rudimentary way. The scholars of Salerno read widely. They translated Arabic texts into Latin, preserving and reintroducing the works of Galen and Hippocrates. They studied the humors, practiced phlebotomy, cataloged herbs, and debated anatomy. They believed that health was the balance of elements hot and cold, wet and dry, and that illness could be treated with the right regimen of food, drink, and environment. Women in white robes, the female healers of Salerno. Remarkably, Salerno was also one of the few places in medieval Europe where women were recognized as legitimate medical practitioners. The most famous among them was Trotula of Salerno, a physician and writer who composed treatises on women's health, childbirth, and gynecology. Trotula's works, particularly De Passionibus Mulierum, on the sufferings of women, were widely copied and used for centuries. They offered practical advice on everything from menstruation to postpartum care. She emphasized hygiene, nutrition, and gentle remedies. Her presence in the Salernitan canon underscores the city's uniqueness. In a time when most women were barred from formal learning, Salerno recognized female expertise. It wasn't a feminist utopia, of course, but it was a place where intellect occasionally mattered more than gender. Other women, too, practiced and taught medicine here, often specializing in female ailments. They were known as Mulieres Salernitanae, the women of Salerno. The role of translation, crossing cultural boundaries. Much of the knowledge preserved at Salerno came not from original discovery, but from translation. In this, the school played a pivotal role in transmitting medical ideas from the Islamic world to Christian Europe. Arabic texts brought from North Africa and Spain, many of them themselves, translations of Greek works were rendered into Latin by multilingual scholars. These included works by Avicenna, Ibn Sina. His canon of medicine became a foundational text in both Islamic and European medicine. Rhazes al-Razi, a Persian physician known for his clinical observations and philosophical writings. Galen, though a Roman, his works had been preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, whose legacy passed through Byzantine and Arabic hands before returning to Latin Europe. These translations were not purely mechanical. They often involved commentary, adaptation, and synthesis. What emerged was not a simple regurgitation of old knowledge, but a new, hybrid tradition, one that blended logic, observation, and inherited authority. Practical training and patient care. Salerno was not just theoretical. It was a working medical center. Scholars were expected to engage with patients. Local nobles and foreign dignitaries often came seeking treatment. The school's location near the pilgrimage route to Monte Cassino meant a steady flow of the sick and wounded. Treatments varied: herbal remedies, controlled diets, bathing, and in some cases, surgery. While invasive procedures were limited, some physicians at Salerno did perform basic operations, including lancing abscesses and setting bones. Diagnostic methods relied heavily on observation, urine analysis, pulse reading, tongue inspection, and questioning. Students learned to correlate symptoms with humoral imbalances. Though crude by modern standards, this was a significant advance over blind superstition. One famous text, Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, the Salernitan Guide to Health, offered advice not just to doctors, but to kings and commoners alike. It covered everything from sleep hygiene to seasonal diets. If you want to be healthy, avoid heavy dinners. Drink wine in moderation and rise with the sun. Not exactly thrilling, but practical and deeply human. Opposition and skepticism. Not everyone welcomed Salerno's approach. Some church authorities feared the secular tone of its teachings. Others distrusted the influence of Arabic and Jewish scholars. The idea of healing the body without explicit reference to Christian doctrine was uncomfortable for many clerics. Still, the school endured. Its fame grew. By the 12th century, it was receiving students from across Europe. Even emperors like Frederick II recognized its value, eventually mandating licensing for physicians trained under its methods. But this rise set the stage for later conflicts. How would Salerno's approach hold up as universities took over the mantle of education? Could its loosely organized system survive the bureaucratization of knowledge? And what happened to Salerno's women scholars as formal medical institutions became more rigid and male-dominated? An unfinished legacy. The Schola Medica Salernitana was not a university. It left behind no grand buildings, no formal faculty. And yet, its impact reverberated through centuries. By bringing together cultures Latin, Greek, Arab, Jewish, Salerno created a model of medical dialogue rarely seen in the medieval world. It showed that healing could be learned, shared, and improved upon. That care did not have to be cloaked entirely in mystery or theology. And that, perhaps, the best medicine begins not with answers, but with curiosity. But what became of this curiosity? As Salerno gave way to new universities, did its legacy fade, or was it quietly absorbed into the foundations of modern medicine? The sun rises slowly over the Gulf of Salerno, casting long shadows across the city's terracotta rooftops. The markets hum with life, the docks receive goods from across the sea, and in a quiet room not far from the cathedral, a physician examines a urine flask held to the light. The color is pale yellow good. The sediment is light better. The scent is modest acceptable. There are no instruments, no tests, no charts. Only observation, smell, texture, and accumulated experience. This is Salerno in the 12th century, where medicine is not yet a science, but it is no longer just a prayer. It is here that rational medicine, systematic, observational, and secular in tone, finds its medieval home. And as the city's reputation grows, so too do the complexities of operating a medical school in a world still deeply shaped by theological authority. From cloister to clinic, a new way of learning. By the mid-12th century, Salerno's medical school had reached its peak. Students came from across Christendom to study texts in Latin, translated from Arabic, which were themselves based on earlier Greek works. They came not to pray for healing, but to learn how to diagnose and treat disease through reason. Instruction was structured, though not formally organized as a university. Students studied a curriculum rooted in the humoral theory: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They read Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Trotula. They memorized the aphorisms of Hippocrates and the Ardicella, a compendium of key medical texts. Many lived in the homes of physicians, apprenticing in the way craftsmen did. There were no degrees yet, but there was learning. And more importantly, there was a culture of questioning, reading, and argument. Salerno's medicine was not revolutionary in its discoveries, but it was revolutionary in its method. It treated medicine as a body of knowledge that could be studied, taught, and debated. Licensing the healer, the influence of Frederick II. As Salerno's fame grew, it attracted not just students but kings. The most important of these was Emperor Frederick II, King of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor, whose court was just down the coast in Palermo. Frederick was a man of letters, a lover of science, and a ruler who believed in order. In 1231, he issued the Constitution of Melfi, also known as the Liber Augustalis, one of the earliest legal codes in medieval Europe. It included strict regulations for physicians. No one shall practice medicine unless he has been examined and approved by the masters of Salerno and licensed by the authorities. This was a turning point. Medicine, once a loose occupation governed by custom and reputation, was now subject to law. Physicians were required to undergo formal instruction, often lasting 5 years, and pass an examination before practicing. The roots of modern medical licensing boards, credentials, standards can be traced to this moment. Frederick's intervention gave Salerno even more legitimacy, and helped protect patients from charlatans and dangerous folk remedies. A medical community in the making. Unlike monastic infirmaries, where healing was private and prayerful, Salerno promoted public knowledge. Medical texts were copied, debated, and disseminated. Laypeople, even nobles and merchants, were encouraged to read works like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, which was essentially a health manual in verse. Use 3 physicians still. First Dr. Diet, then Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Mary Will. It was simple advice: drink moderately, sleep well, exercise, but it reflected a deeper shift. Health was no longer entirely in God's hands. It could be managed, controlled, planned for. And that idea in the Middle Ages was quietly radical. Medical ethics and the role of the doctor. Salerno's physicians also wrestled with the ethics of care. Many texts emphasize the physician's duty to observe, to listen, and to do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath, though not always directly invoked, was echoed in practice. Patients were not merely bodies, they were whole beings. Treatment considered diet, environment, emotional state, and social condition. For women, female practitioners like Trotula ensured a level of care rarely available elsewhere. Though the knowledge was flawed based on a fragile theory of humors, it was applied thoughtfully. And yet, as rational medicine grew in Salerno, so too did the tension with the religious worldview that still dominated Europe. The tension with theology. Not all were pleased by Salerno's secular tone. Church leaders grew wary. Medicine was, after all, a practice deeply entangled with questions of mortality, sin, and divine will. Was it appropriate to study the body so closely? Could human reason truly comprehend the mysteries of illness? And what of treatments that contradicted fasting or other spiritual disciplines? Some feared that medicine encouraged pride, a belief in human mastery over life and death. Others warned against the influence of non-Christian texts, particularly those from Arabic scholars, whose works, though rich in science, were linked to Islam. And yet Salerno persisted. For decades, it walked a careful line grounded in classical authority, mindful of church doctrine, but ultimately committed to rational inquiry. Anatomy without dissection. One of the clearest examples of the limits Salerno faced was in the study of anatomy. Unlike Islamic centers in Cordoba or later Christian universities in Padua, Salerno was not known for dissections. The human body, considered sacred, was rarely opened. Physicians learned anatomy from texts, illustrations, and inference. They studied the writings of Galen, who had dissected animals but not humans, and extrapolated from that. As a result, much of medieval anatomy was theoretical, more philosophy than biology. Organs had meanings. The liver was the seat of blood and courage, the heart of heat and life force, the brain of reason. It was not until centuries later, with Vesalius and the Renaissance anatomists, that these models were corrected. But in Salerno's time, they represented the best available synthesis of inherited knowledge. Jewish and Arabic contributions, silent giants. The city's Jewish physicians, though often left unnamed in formal records, were vital to Salerno's medical tradition. Fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, they served as translators, scholars, and sometimes practitioners. Figures like Constantinus Africanus, a North African Christian convert who settled in Monte Cassino, played a critical role. He brought dozens of Arabic medical texts to Salerno and translated them into Latin, effectively shaping the curriculum for generations to come. These works introduced ideas about contagion, surgical techniques, and pharmacology that were centuries ahead of their time. It was through this cultural bridge, often unacknowledged, that Salerno's medicine was able to grow. Decline and legacy. By the 13th century, Salerno's prominence began to wane. The rise of new universities in Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris drew students away. These institutions had more formal structures, larger faculties, and papal support. The secular, eclectic tone that had made Salerno great also made it vulnerable. It lacked central authority. It had no charters, no protected endowments. And as the church grew more conservative, the school's association with non-Christian texts became a liability. Still, the influence of Salerno lived on. Its texts were copied across Europe. Its graduates served in royal courts and urban hospitals. Its ethics, its rational approach, and its integration of diverse traditions helped lay the foundation for later medical humanism. A quiet revolution. In the end, Salerno did not cure the world's diseases. It did not discover germ theory or invent anesthesia. But it did something subtler. It taught that the body could be studied, that illness had patterns, and that knowledge shared across boundaries could heal. It whispered the idea that health was not just a matter of chance or prayer, but of care, routine, and understanding. And in that whisper, the future of medicine stirred. But as medicine moved forward toward dissection, regulation, and professionalization, what happened to the women, the translators, and the empiricists who had once shaped its foundations at Salerno? You walk the streets of modern Salerno, now stones polished by centuries of feet, cafes humming quietly in the Mediterranean light. There is little left to remind you of the once celebrated Scola Medica Salernitana. No vast university halls, no preserved lecture theaters. Only traces. In an old manuscript here, a forgotten plaque there, and the stories that have nearly slipped away. Salerno's decline was not abrupt. Like many medieval institutions, it faded slowly, its influence eroded by time, centralization, and shifting cultural tides. Yet in its fading, something remarkable happened. Its memory diffused into other places, other forms, and other institutions. This final chapter in Salerno's story is not about triumph, but endurance, not about monuments, but memory. The beginning of the end. By the 13th century, as universities flourished across Europe, Salerno's structure began to look antiquated. It had no charter from the Pope, no endowment from a king. It operated as a loose community of scholars and practitioners rather than a formal institution. The newly rising universities in Bologna, Montpellier, and later Paris offered something more desirable to ambitious students and clerics alike: prestige, structure, degrees, and ecclesiastical approval. At the same time, a subtle but significant shift in medicine was taking place. Where Salerno had emphasized practice, translation, and empirical treatment, the new universities leaned toward theoretical medicine. They elevated authority, especially Galen's and Avicenna's, above observation. Salerno had been the meeting place of cultures. The universities were increasingly homogeneous, Christian, Latin-speaking, and male. The loss of inclusivity. Perhaps the most painful element of Salerno's decline was the erasure of its pluralistic roots. Arabic medical texts, once so central to Salerno's curriculum, were increasingly viewed with suspicion in the West, especially following the rise of religious conflicts and the fall of Muslim territories in Spain and Sicily. Their authors were often cited without credit or quietly excised from copied works. Jewish scholars, too, were pushed to the margins. Accusations of heresy and social exclusions made it harder for Jewish physicians to practice, even though many continued to be consulted in private, respected, but officially silenced. And perhaps most quietly of all, the women of Salerno, like Trotula, faded into legend. For centuries, her name was doubted. Her works were attributed to male authors or dismissed as apocryphal. The idea that a woman could have written foundational texts on gynecology and women's health was too uncomfortable for the emerging medical orthodoxy. By the 15th century, the Mulier Salernitany had disappeared from the record. What had once been accepted that women could be both healers and authors became controversial, then forgotten. The humanist resurgence, a quiet influence. Yet, even as Salerno declined as an institution, Its influence lived on, woven into the practices and ethics of the physicians it had trained and the texts it had spread. When the Renaissance bloomed in Italy in the 15th century, it carried forward many of Salerno's ideals: the study of the human body, the preservation of classical texts, and a new emphasis on human dignity and care. Indeed, when Andreas Vesalius opened human bodies in Padua to chart anatomy in ways Galen never had, he was fulfilling a Salernitan dream, bringing empirical observation back into medicine. When physicians began to experiment with treatment rather than rely on authority, they echoed the pragmatism of the Salernitan guides. And when, centuries later, nursing orders like the Daughters of Charity began emphasizing patient cleanliness, bedside manner, and compassion, they echoed what the women of Salerno had practiced long before. Fragments that endured. Salerno may not have built a lasting institutional legacy, but its writings did persist. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, the health guide first written in Latin verse for the benefit of kings and princes, became one of the most widely circulated medical texts in Europe during the Middle Ages. It was translated into multiple languages and reprinted well into the 16th century. Its advice was often quaint but practical. Avoid late suppers, rise early. Stay cheerful, avoid anger. Don't overfill the stomach, nor let it go dry. These were not grand theories but small human habits. Salerno's medicine was not dramatic, it was steady, it was lived. A modern echo, medicine for the whole person. Today, medicine often feels mechanical, clinical, rushed. But the Salernitan model, imperfect as it was, reminds us of something enduring, that care is more than cure. Salerno's healers treated the full person. They asked about diet, sleep, stress, environment. They believed illness arose from imbalance not just in the body, but in life. And while they lacked microscopes and antibiotics, they had an understanding of the human experience that resonates even now. Their medicine was not just about intervention, but prevention. Not about domination over disease, but collaboration with the rhythms of the body and nature. It is no coincidence that some of the modern trends in healthcare, holistic medicine, integrated care, emphasis on patient lifestyle echo Salerno's ethos more than they do the rigid institutions that followed. The ghost in the curriculum. In modern medical schools, Salerno is rarely taught. If mentioned, it's in passing, a footnote in the long history of European medicine, yet its fingerprints are everywhere. In the idea that medical education requires structured study. In the notion that different traditions can inform each other. In the quiet assertion that women, too, have knowledge worth preserving. Even the word regimen, as in treatment regimen, owes something to Salernitan texts that organized care not by miracle, but by measured practice. A final walk through Salerno. Let us return one last time to medieval Salerno. The sea is calm, the city modest. In a courtyard, a physician reads from a worn text while a student copies notes by candlelight. A woman healer, robe cinched at the waist, prepares a salve from rosemary and thyme. Nearby, a translator pores over an Arabic manuscript, lips moving silently, wrestling with meaning. They do not know they are building a legacy. They are simply working, healing, thinking. And that perhaps is the essence of Salerno's wisdom, not the quest for glory, but for understanding. Reflections across time. In a world fractured by dogma and conflict, Salerno offered a model of collaborative knowledge. In a time that silenced women, it preserved their voices for a time. In an age without antibiotics or technology, it emphasized balance, observation, and care. And in doing so, it laid a quiet foundation beneath the more visible structures of modern medicine. So the next time a doctor asks about your sleep, your stress, or your meals, remember Salerno. Not for what it built, but for what it seeded. A medicine not only of the body, but of the whole person. Story 3. The Leper Houses of Medieval England. The wind tugs at your cloak as you pass through the city gate, but your journey is not over. Just beyond the stone walls of a bustling English town, perhaps Norwich, York, or Winchester, there lies another gate. Smaller, quieter, less traveled. Beyond it stands a collection of low buildings, timber-framed with tiled roofs, surrounded by hedges or a shallow ditch. A chapel bell rings softly in the distance. No one calls out. No vendors shout. The world here is hushed. You've reached the leper house, also known as a lazar house, a place not quite within society, but not fully outside it either. A liminal space for the afflicted, the feared, and the forgotten. It is the 12th century. In England, as across much of Europe, leprosy has taken on a deeply symbolic weight. It is not just a disease, it is a sentence. And yet, in this strange, half-hidden corner of the medieval world, there is a story of care, order, routine, and resilience. Let us step inside. Understanding leprosy, more than a disease. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, is caused by a slow-acting bacterial infection. But in medieval times, the understanding of the illness was shaped more by theology than biology. The term leprosy in medieval sources often referred to a broad category of chronic skin diseases. Symptoms could include lesions, nodules, numbness, and facial disfigurement. But diagnosis was imprecise. Conditions such as psoriasis, lupus, or eczema were sometimes mistakenly classified as leprosy. Still, the cultural meaning was unmistakable. Leprosy was associated with uncleanness, sin, and divine punishment. It evoked the imagery of biblical outcasts Lazarus at the gate, covered in sores, begging for crumbs. Leprosy frightened people not because of what it did, but because of what it seemed to mean, that the sufferer had been marked. And yet, medieval England responded not only with fear, but also with structure. The rise of the leper house. From the 11th to the 14th centuries, over 300 leper houses were established in England. Often founded by religious orders or wealthy patrons, they were intended to remove lepers from the heart of the community, while still ensuring their spiritual and physical needs were met. These institutions were usually located just outside city limits, on main roads or pilgrimage routes. Their placement allowed the sick to remain accessible to charity passers-by, might leave food or alms, but also safely separated from healthy townsfolk. A typical leper house included a chapel, often the central structure, a row of small individual huts or cubicles for residents, a hall or common room for meals, a garden for cultivation and fresh air, a boundary wall, gate, or symbolic marker of separation. Some were attached to monasteries. Others functioned independently under lay or clerical management. Admission was often restricted to confirmed cases, though again, diagnosis was subjective. The ritual of exile. Admission to a leper house was not merely a medical event, it was a ritual, and in many cases, a funeral of the living. Once diagnosed, a leper might undergo a formal separation ceremony. A priest, in full vestments, would pronounce the person dead to the world, sprinkling them with earth from the grave. The afflicted would then don a distinctive cloak, carry a wooden clapper or bell, and be led out of town. One 12th century rite instructed, "You shall not enter the church, nor market, nor mill, nor tavern. You shall keep to the leper's path. You shall not touch what others use, nor drink from their vessels." The intention was both protective and symbolic. The leper became a living penitent, an image of suffering that reminded others of mortality and divine justice. But once inside the leper house, a different rhythm emerged. Daily life in the leper house. The day began with prayers, usually chanted in the chapel. Residents, though disfigured or in pain, were still expected to participate. Attendance, even from a distance, was part of their penitential role. Meals followed a simple diet of bread, ale, pottage, and on rare occasions meat or cheese. Food was provided by endowments, donations, or the labor of the residents themselves. Some tended gardens, kept chickens, or performed light tasks. Clothing was uniform dark robes, cowls, sometimes gloves. Tools and utensils were not shared, and residents were instructed to eat apart from visitors or caretakers. In many houses, especially the wealthier ones, a small staff oversaw operations. A warden or master managed supplies and enforced rules. A chaplain led services. A servant or nurse might deliver food, clean, or tend wounds. And yet, despite the hardship, many lepers found a degree of stability here that was absent in wider society. They had a bed, a roof, ritual, a community of others who shared their fate. Voices in the silence. Though few personal writings survive from the lepers themselves, we catch glimpses through records, wills, and donations. Some left small bequests to their fellow residents or to the chapel. Others expressed gratitude for having found spiritual peace in their exile. Many took pride in the religious character of their lives, living as penitents, close to God, away from temptation. There is one recorded example from the leper hospital of St. Leonard in York, where a leper named Matilda, likely a former servant, was granted a lifetime place. She grew herbs in the garden and, according to the records, spoke kindly to those newly afflicted. These lives were not glamorous, they were not triumphant, but they were not meaningless. Care amid stigma. It is tempting to view medieval leper houses solely as places of cruel isolation, but that would miss the complexity. Yes, lepers were feared. Yes, their condition was misunderstood and stigmatized. But the leper houses also represented an effort, however flawed, to provide care, to impose order on fear, to offer the sick not just seclusion but dignity. They were often well-funded. Rich patrons donated land, mills, and tithes. Kings issued charters protecting their rights. Townspeople, moved by pity or faith, left bread, clothing, or coin at their gates. Some houses even became self-sustaining communities, with elected officers, rules of governance, and mutual aid. The story is not one of abandonment, but of compartmentalized compassion. Society's solution to fear was not only exile but structured charity. A still world. As you stand in the chapel of a leper house, stone floors worn smooth by years of shuffling feet, you feel the stillness. Not silence from emptiness, but from endurance. Here, the rhythms of bells, chants, and seasons continue, even as the world changes outside the wall. The leper house is not a place of healing in the modern sense. Most residents will not recover, but it is a place of meaning, however quiet. An unfinished tale. And yet one must ask, what happens when the disease begins to disappear? When leprosy gives way to plague, to war, to political upheaval? What becomes of these houses and the people who lived and died in them? Time does not move quickly in the leper house. It does not leap forward in revolutions or reform. Instead, it creeps first as a change in funding, then a shift in rules, later an emptier dormitory, a garden left untended, a chapel bell that rings less often. By the late 14th century, the slow, quiet rhythm of England's leper houses had begun to change. Leprosy, once feared and stigmatized, was fading. Not entirely, and not all at once, but by degrees so gradual that no one moment marks its end. The decline of leprosy as a common illness in England brought with it not just medical relief, but social and institutional uncertainty. What happens when the need for an institution disappears, but the institution remains? The answer, as we shall see, is not simple. Where did leprosy go? By the mid-1300s, leprosy cases began to decline across much of Europe. Historians have offered several explanations. Improved immunity over generations of exposure. Changes in the bacterial strain. Modern genetics suggests this possibility. The rise of deadlier diseases, especially the Black Death, which killed vast swaths of the population, quickly perhaps eliminating those most vulnerable to slower diseases. Improved urban sanitation and diet, at least in select regions. Whatever the cause, by the 15th century, the once common practice of formally diagnosing and segregating lepers had all but disappeared in many English towns. Fewer leper processions, fewer admissions to lazar houses, and fewer donors contributing to institutions now perceived as serving a vanishing population. But the houses did not vanish overnight. The structures remained. The buildings, the chapels, dormitories, cloisters, and kitchens still stood. Many were made of stone. They had endowments. They owned land, mills, fishing rights, and farms. They were part of the economic fabric of the local community. So rather than being destroyed, many leper houses were repurposed. Some became almshouses for the elderly, the blind, the poor. These were practical choices. The sickbeds were already there, and the rule-based structure of daily life easily transferred to aged care. Residents now included the impoverished elderly, not just the physically afflicted. Others were absorbed into nearby monasteries or chantries, their revenues redirected toward the maintenance of clergy or the saying of masses for noble souls. Some continued to admit the chronically ill or disabled under broader terms. Yet in many cases the name remained: St. Mary's Leper House, the Hospital of St. Leonard for lepers. Generations passed through its gates never having seen a case of true leprosy. What had once been a house for the outcast became, gradually, a house for the marginal in a broader, more ambiguous sense. Lives without records. As institutions shifted, so too did their records and their residents' identities. Earlier leper houses had kept detailed charters of admission, name, parish, symptoms, sometimes even family status. But in the later centuries, with fewer lepers and broader eligibility, documentation thinned. Most of the later residents, aged, infirm, poor, left little behind. They were not monks. They were not nobility. They did not write letters or keep journals. Their lives are preserved only in fragments: a name in a donation roll, a burial in the chapel yard, a passing mention in the bishop's visitation. Their suffering, routine, and even kindness, like that of Matilda in York, or John of Ely, who planted cabbages for others, fade quietly. The Black Death changes everything. Then came 1348. The arrival of the Black Death fundamentally altered the structure and purpose of care institutions in England. Where leprosy had been slow, symbolic, and long-lasting, plague was fast, apocalyptic, and utterly destabilizing. Monasteries and hospitals lost staff in days. Clergy died in droves. Fields went untilled. Cities emptied. The leper house, designed for chronic care, was not suited to the crisis mode of plague. It was too small. Its quarantine was too permanent. Its focus on spiritual penance seemed almost quaint in the face of mass death. But something strange happened. In the wake of the plague, some former leper houses were revived as emergency care centers, ad hoc spaces for the dying, the orphaned, or the unclaimed dead. They were used as way stations, not permanent homes. This was temporary, but it reminded local communities that the structures still had utility. Still, as the 15th century progressed and plague waves recurred, attention turned toward urban hospitals, larger almshouses, and civic-funded institutions rather than religious ones. The leper house became, increasingly, a backwater of care, respected, tolerated, but no longer essential. Legal and social reforms, the end of autonomy. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, England saw a wave of centralization and regulation in charitable giving. The Statute of Mortmain limited how much land could be given to religious houses. Kings and bishops began exerting greater control over hospital incomes. Visitations were more frequent. Some houses were accused of mismanagement. Others fell into neglect. With the Reformation in the 1530s and the dissolution of the monasteries, many leper hospitals lost their clerical patrons. Endowments were seized, lands were sold, chapels were dismantled, and the remaining residents, poor, elderly, voiceless, were often forced to move elsewhere. By 1600, only a handful of England's leper houses remained active, and even these bore little resemblance to their founding purpose. Their names lingered on maps, in parish records, in church dedications, but their meaning had changed. Memory and misremembering. The story of the leper house is complicated by how it was remembered or misremembered. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic historians painted leper houses as brutal prisons, or alternatively, as saintly sanctuaries. Neither image was fully accurate. In reality, they had been ambiguous places, compassionate in some ways, isolating in others. Their residents were not all martyrs nor all victims. They were people, and their institutions evolved not by design but by necessity. In archaeological digs near medieval English towns, excavations of old leprosaria show signs of care. Healed bones, repaired huts, buried rosaries, shared meals. These were not places of punishment. They were places of endurance, a legacy without inheritance. And so we ask, what do we inherit from these institutions? Unlike the great universities or royal hospitals, leper houses left no institutional descendants. They are not part of NHS trusts. They do not appear in histories of medical progress. But their legacy is quieter. The principle of isolation as a tool of public health, later refined in plague policies, TB sanatoriums, and modern quarantines, can be traced here. The ritualization of chronic care, including a structured rhythm of meals, prayers, and rules, echoes in modern hospice movements. And the idea that even those deemed unfit for society still deserved structured care and spiritual dignity was, in its time, profound. Perhaps most enduringly, the Lazar House reminds us that healthcare is shaped not only by need, but by fear, law, theology, and community memory. And yet, what happened to the physical remains of these houses? Did their walls become homes? Did their chapels become schools? Are we walking unknowingly on the graves of those who lived and died beyond society's gates? You walk through a quiet field just outside the modern city of Winchester. The hum of cars and distant voices carries on the wind, but beneath your feet lies a forgotten chapter of history. St. Mary Magdalene, one of England's largest leper hospitals. The grass is thick now, the buildings long gone. A few low humps in the earth, scattered stones, perhaps a lichen-covered wall fragment. This is all that remains above ground. But the story isn't over. In recent decades, archaeologists, historians, and local communities have begun to rediscover what the written records omitted. And in the soil, the graves, and the bones, the truth of England's leper houses quietly speaks. These were not just places of disease. They were places of resilience. They were shaped not only by stigma but by structure, and in their silent endurance they left us lessons that still matter today. Digging into the past, what archaeology reveals. At sites like Winchester, Chichester, and Hereford, excavations of former leper hospitals have revealed complex, organized communities. Graveyards laid out with care, sometimes with markers. Chapel foundations aligned to the east, in keeping with Christian burial traditions. Stone footings of dormitories, kitchens, and gatehouses. Fragments of devotional objects, crosses, prayer beads, and tokens. But most telling of all are the skeletons. In Winchester, for example, over 100 burials were carefully studied, with many showing clear signs of advanced leprosy: bone resorption in the face, damage to the nasal cavity, and thinning of long bones. Yet these skeletons also show healing, lesions that had begun to mend, fractures that were set, wounds that were tended. This tells us something crucial. These people lived with the disease for years and they received consistent, often compassionate care. They were not dumped into a ditch. They were not left to rot. They were buried with honor, faces eastward, hands folded in prayer. A geography of margins. Leper houses were always placed at the edge, on roads leading into town, near gates, rivers, or hillsides, close enough for contact, far enough for distance. Their geography reflected a social truth: these were people both inside and outside society. They could receive alms but not enter the marketplace. They could pray but not attend mass with the healthy. They could live but always on terms defined by others. And yet, this liminality also offered certain freedoms. Some leper houses developed self-governing systems, with elected officers, gardens, and communal kitchens. Many lepers lived for decades within these settings, forming bonds, creating rhythms, even cultivating a kind of purpose within their enclosure. They were not simply victims. They were inhabitants of a parallel society, structured, isolated, and yet connected. The echo in language and law. Long after the institutions themselves faded, the idea of the leper house lingered in language. The word Lazar, once used for a person with leprosy, comes from Lazarus, the beggar in Luke's Gospel who lay at the rich man's gate. The term leper came to mean any person rejected by society, even outside a medical context. In legal history, Lazar houses represent some of the earliest uses of quarantine principles, predating formal plague quarantines by centuries. In modern public health, echoes of this practice remain in isolation protocols, hospitals designed for infectious disease, and ethical debates about balancing individual rights and collective safety. Even our discomfort with stigmatized illness, from HIV in the 1980s to COVID-19 today, draws on long cultural memories of exile and fear. We have advanced, but the instincts persist. Forgotten names, remembered structures. Many of the original leper houses were eventually converted, demolished, or simply absorbed into the changing landscape. A few notable sites include St. Giles Hospital in Norwich, one of the best-endowed leper hospitals, later converted into an almshouse and still operating as a care facility into the modern period. St. Bartholomew's in London, evolved into a major hospital, though originally founded with leper care in mind. Chichester's St. James. Excavations here revealed graves with leprosy markers and careful, long-term burials. And yet most others were erased. Their stones were quarried for barns or fences, their lands sold to fund parish churches. Their names survived only in local legends: Lepers Lane, Spitalfields, Lazar Hill. The people who once inhabited them: Marjorie of the Red Cloak, Thomas the Piper, the nameless young woman buried with her cross, have faded entirely. A different kind of healing. In some ways, the leper houses failed. They did not cure disease. They did not fully eradicate stigma. They reinforced a theology that associated illness with sin. And yet, they succeeded in something profoundly human. They offered routine when all else was chaos. They provided shelter when no one else would. They created meaning, even for those cast aside. Modern healthcare often struggles with chronic illness, isolation, and aging. The leper house reminds us that healing is not always about recovery, but about dignity, structure, and recognition. Lessons for now. As we consider the history of medieval leper houses, we're invited not to condemn their ignorance, but to reflect on our own assumptions. How do we treat those whose illnesses frighten us? Where do we place the boundaries between care and exclusion? What rituals do we offer the sick, and what silence do we impose on them? And most importantly, when a person's life cannot be cured, can it still be cared for? The leper house, in all its complexity, answers yes. A final thought. You step away from the quiet field, the remains of St. Mary Magdalene behind you, The wind moves gently through the grass. The stones lie patient beneath the soil. There are no plaques, no statues, no prayers echoing through the chapel now lost, but still they endure the memory of those who lived behind the second gate, who were feared but not forgotten. And perhaps that is their greatest gift, a reminder that care can persist even in exile, that institutions may crumble, but compassion, when embedded in routine, leaves traces no wind can scatter. Story 4. Hospitals of the Crusades, the Knights Hospitaller and Battlefield Care. You stand before the walls of Jerusalem in the year 1095, the sun high, the dust clinging to your cloak, and the sweat trickling down your neck despite the dry air. The city is a labyrinth of stone and tension, sacred to three great religions, and on the eve of the First Crusade a place of both reverence and fragility. To the west, near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, pilgrims from across Christendom arrive by the dozens, many half-starved, sunburned, sick from weeks of travel across sea and desert. They stumble into the holy city, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. For them, the journey is not a tour, it is penance. To suffer was to imitate Christ. But not all die on the road. Near the pilgrim routes within Jerusalem's walls lies a quiet refuge, the Hospital of St. John, a modest complex operated by monks who call themselves the Brothers of the Hospital, or in time, the Knights Hospitaller. Before the swords, before the armor, before the sieges and fortresses, the Knights of St. John were healers. This is their lesser-known beginning, not with war cries but with washing wounds. Origins in mercy, a hospital for pilgrims. The hospital in Jerusalem traces its roots to the early 11th century, before the arrival of the Crusaders. It was founded by merchants from the Italian city of Amalfi, who received permission from the ruling Fatimid Caliphate to establish a Latin Christian hospital and hospice within the city. Its location was strategic, just outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, at the heart of the Christian quarter. Its mission was simple but radical: to receive, shelter, and care for pilgrims, no matter their station. This was not a monastery in the Cluniac tradition, nor a civic almshouse. It was an early international hospital, serving Latin Christians traveling east. The road to Jerusalem was treacherous. Bandits, illness, heat, and hunger claimed countless pilgrims long before they ever glimpsed the holy city. The Hospital of St. John offered more than a bed. It offered baths, food, herbs, and silence, a place to collapse and recover. Its staff included monks, nurses, cooks, and translators. It treated the poor without question, a reflection of the biblical injunction to serve the least of these. And unlike most European infirmaries of the time, this hospital had to function in multicultural, multi-faith conditions. Its early staff learned to navigate both Latin and Arabic, Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic, Jewish customs and Muslim authorities. Brother Gerard, the man behind the mission. Much of what we know about the hospital's early days comes through the figure of Brother Gerard, the man credited with formalizing the hospital into a religious institution. Gerard likely arrived from Amalfi, though some sources claim he was French or Provençal. He is described in later accounts as humble, gentle, and fiercely devoted to care. But like many medieval figures, his life is blurred by hagiography. What seems clear is this: around 1070–1080, Gerard helped to formalize the hospital's operations, codify its rules, and build its identity as a religious brotherhood devoted to hospitality, healing, and humility. He styled himself and his companions not as monks but as servants of the poor. Their emblem was simple, a white cross on a black background. Their motto, Tuitio Fidei et Obsequium Pauperum, defense of the faith and service to the poor. Gerard would later be recognized as the founder of the Order of St. John. The Crusaders arrive, a city transformed. In 1099, the First Crusade reached its climax. After a brutal siege, Christian forces captured Jerusalem, leaving behind blood-soaked streets and deep scars on the city's population. Amidst the carnage, the hospital of St. John remained standing. Its brothers, protected by their reputation for charity even during Muslim rule, were spared the worst of the violence. But the city around them had changed. Latin Christian rule had been established. Pilgrims now flooded into the city in greater numbers, many still sick, wounded, or dying. The hospital had to expand rapidly. What had once been a modest refuge became a sprawling complex, reportedly able to accommodate up to 1,000 patients at its height. Its structure was detailed and hierarchical. Wards separated by illness or condition. Individual beds, each shared only by one patient, rare in the medieval world. A chapel central to daily rhythm. Storage rooms, herb gardens, and kitchens. And rules emphasizing cleanliness, order, and silence. The sick were to be treated as if they were Christ himself, a deeply theological approach to health care that emphasized dignity even in suffering. Medicine in the crossroads of civilization. Jerusalem's location at the cultural crossroads of Latin Europe, Byzantine East, and Islamic Middle East made the hospital a unique center of medical knowledge exchange. Brothers of the hospital began adopting Arabic medical practices, including the use of alcohol as an antiseptic, refined surgical tools, texts by Islamic physicians such as Avicenna and Al-Razi, herbal remedies unfamiliar in the West, pomegranate for digestion, sumac for wounds. While many Christian physicians remained suspicious of Saracen medicine, the Brothers of St. John, driven by necessity, showed pragmatic curiosity. Healing required whatever tools worked. The hospital thus became a silent node of knowledge transmission, bridging East and West, preserving texts, and incorporating diverse methods long before the Enlightenment claimed this mantle. Care under siege, battlefield healing emerges. With the formation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, new challenges emerged. Pilgrims were not just sick, they were also attacked. Skirmishes, raids, and open battles required more than a stable hospice. Gradually, the Brothers of the Hospital evolved. They began escorting pilgrims. They acquired arms. They trained in defensive combat not for conquest but to protect their patients. From these changes, a new figure emerged, the military monk. By 1113, Pope Paschal II issued a papal bull formally recognizing the Order of St. John, giving it independence and a dual mission, caring for the poor and defending the Holy Land. This was the beginning of the Knights Hospitaller, a military order with healing at its core. The blurring of boundaries when care meets power. The transformation from humble caregivers to armored knights raises complex questions. Was it necessary? Perhaps. The Crusader states were fragile and violence was frequent, but the change marked a shift in identity. Healing and war, two opposed instincts, now lived in the same institution. The Hospital of St. John was still operational. Patients were still treated. But now the brothers also bore arms, held land, and answered to princes. Could an institution serve both the sword and the sickbed? Could it remain committed to its origins while participating in conquest? And more importantly, how did this shift affect the way care was given? Unanswered in the dust. The sick continued to come. Pilgrims, soldiers, civilians wounded in the violence of war. The brothers continued to serve, but their uniforms now bore both the cross and the blade. Did the patients notice a change? Did they feel the hand that dressed their wound now gripped a sword by night? And as the order grew wealthier, building castles and fleets, did it forget the pilgrims who once collapsed on Jerusalem's dusty roads, seeking only a bowl of broth and a clean bed? You walk through the great gates of a stone fortress, not a hospital now, but a compound bristling with towers, armed guards, and fluttering banners. It is the mid-12th century, and you are entering the Hospitaller Commandery at Margat, a coastal stronghold in the Crusader state of Tripoli. The walls are thick. The air smells of horses, oil, and salt. But somewhere inside this militarized complex, behind the walls and weapons, there is still an infirmary. The Order of St. John, born of mercy in the streets of Jerusalem, has changed. It has grown powerful, militarized, fortified, hierarchical, and yet at its core it claims to remain what it always was, a hospital. The tension between healing and warfare now defines the Hospitallers. This is no longer just a religious brotherhood, it is a multinational institution that controls land, commands knights, and negotiates with kings. Its members defend, govern, and fight, but also heal. What happens when an institution built to care becomes one, also tasked to conquer? A military order emerges. The transformation of the Hospitallers began soon after the papal recognition in 1113, when Pope Paschal II declared the hospital free from all authority save the Pope. The order was now autonomous, answerable to Rome alone, and began to receive donations of land, money, and privileges from nobles across Europe. By the 1140s, the order had two arms: the Brothers of the Hospital, who served the sick and poor; the knights who bore arms, trained for war, and defended territory. These were not separate orders, but different branches of the same institution. Knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, like monks, but were trained in arms and rode into battle under the Hospitaller banner. Their main charge was to defend pilgrims and Christian holdings in the Holy Land, but they also supported crusading armies, manned border fortresses, and patrolled key trade routes. The hospital in Jerusalem remained the heart of the order, but new commanderies, part monastery, part military base, part medical center, appeared across the Crusader states and back in Europe. Hospitals behind fortress walls. Despite the growing emphasis on military activity, hospital work remained central to the Hospitallers' mission. The main hospital in Jerusalem continued to operate, reportedly with over 1,000 beds, organized into wards by condition and gender. Patients were provided individual bedding, an extraordinary luxury at the time. Meals were served on silver platters for the sickest patients, emphasizing dignity and spiritual importance. The rules were strict. Brothers were to wash the feet of the poor on admission. No patient was to be turned away, regardless of origin. The dying were to be confessed, communed, and buried with ceremony. Brothers could not refuse service, even in danger. Women were also involved, though typically in supporting roles. Lay sisters, often widows or noblewomen, helped with care, cooking, and laundry, especially for female patients. In war zones, the Hospitallers operated field hospitals, though the scale and frequency of these are debated. Some accounts describe tent infirmaries, mobile units that followed crusading armies, treating wounded soldiers and pilgrims alike. Even in remote castles, a small hospital wing was standard, serving local villagers, soldiers, and brothers. Blending medical traditions. One of the unique features of the Hospitallers' work was their continued openness to non-Latin medical knowledge. Operating in multicultural lands, they relied on Arabic surgical texts, including illustrated manuals, herbal remedies grown in castle gardens and drawn from Levantan traditions, Greek humoral theory, preserved through Islamic translations, knowledge from Jewish physicians, who often served unofficially in Christian and Muslim lands alike. While the Church in Europe was often hostile to non-Christian science, the Hospitallers, out of necessity, practiced pragmatic medicine. The battlefield required results, not orthodoxy. This makes the Hospitallers one of the few medieval Western institutions to apply international medical knowledge on a large scale, centuries before universities embraced such learning. Care or control, the question of power. As the order grew wealthier, it attracted both admiration and suspicion. By the late 12th century, the Hospitallers owned vast estates across France, England, Spain, and Italy. They built fortresses at strategic points: Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Margate on the coast, Belvoir in Galilee. Each fortress included a garrison of knights and soldiers, a chapel for daily prayer, a hospital for care and quarantine, granaries, cisterns, and workshops for self-sufficiency. But critics both inside and outside the church began to ask, had the mission shifted? Was the order still about caring for the sick, or had it become a military political power with a charitable facade? Historians still debate the sincerity of the Hospitallers' medical mission during this period. Some argue that care remained central. Others see a drift, the hospital wing shrinking in favor of towers, walls, and war rooms. Even within the order, tensions arose. Some brothers objected to the blending of monastic discipline and martial training, but the needs of the Holy Land and the expectations of donors overrode dissent. Endurance through catastrophe. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin was a seismic event. The city that had birthed the Hospitaller mission was lost. Many hospitals and chapels were abandoned or destroyed. Brothers were killed or captured. The order's main hospital had to be relocated. And yet the Hospitallers endured. They moved their headquarters to Acre, a port city that became the heart of Christian military operations in the region. There, they built a new hospital, described in some accounts as multi-storied, stone-built, and staffed with both physicians and caretakers. It included a pharmacy, surgical rooms, isolation quarters, an attached cemetery for the dead. When Acre fell in 1291, the Hospitallers retreated first to Cyprus, then to Rhodes, and finally, in the 16th century, to Malta, each time carrying with them their hospital model. At each site, they built new hospitals, adapted to new needs, and maintained the rule that the sick must be treated as though they were the Lord himself. The two faces of the order. By the end of the 13th century, the dual nature of the Hospitallers was fully entrenched. On one hand, military rulers building castles, commanding fleets fighting the Ottomans. On the other, hospital administrators, treating plague victims, managing pharmacies, and writing medical manuals. To many in Europe, they were noble defenders. To others, they were powerful landowners. But for the sick, those who found refuge in their wards, the Hospitallers remained, above all, caregivers. Whatever else changed, the bed, the basin, the balm still awaited within the fortress walls. A question in the ruins. Today, the massive remains of Hospitaller castles still stand across the eastern Mediterranean. Their battlements are well preserved, but in the shadows of their towers lie forgotten infirmary rooms, collapsed sick bays, and burial grounds for the poor. Which legacy matters more, the stone walls that resisted siege, or the wooden beds where feverish pilgrims found peace? The sea crashes against the walls of Valletta, Malta, in the late 16th century. A line of cannon faces the harbor, and the courtyards echo with the steps of armored men. This is no longer Jerusalem, no longer Acre, not even Rhodes. It is Malta, a rocky, sun-drenched island at the edge of Europe, and it has become the final redoubt of an ancient order. Here, the Knights Hospitaller, exiled time and again, have made their last great stand not against disease, but against history itself. And remarkably, they've brought something with them that few military orders carry through the centuries: a hospital. Their fortress hospital in Valletta, known simply as the Sacra Infermeria, may be one of the finest medical complexes of the early modern period. Its long, vaulted ward, running over 150 meters, rivals the chapels and castles of its day. It is here, surrounded by marble floors, iron cots, and endless stone, that the story of the Hospitallers, once humble caretakers in Jerusalem, reaches its strange and enduring conclusion. The fall of the Holy Land. After the fall of Acre in 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the Levant, the Knights Hospitaller were forced to retreat. Their hospital in Jerusalem, once the beating heart of their mission, was lost. Their brothers scattered, but they did not dissolve. Instead, they restructured, relocated, and true to their name endured. In 1309, they established their headquarters on the island of Rhodes, building new hospitals, castles, and naval defenses. In 1522, after a prolonged siege by the Ottomans, they were expelled again. In 1530, Emperor Charles V granted them the islands of Malta and Gozo, where they would remain for over 2 centuries. Each time they moved, the knights brought with them the trappings of governance, archives, rules, relics, and medical knowledge. The Sacra Infermeria, a hospital like no other. By the late 1500s, the knights had constructed a hospital in Valletta that combined military precision with medical advancement. The Sacra Infermeria was designed to care for hundreds, and it became a model for early modern hospital design. Its features included a grand central ward, naturally ventilated and lighted, with space for 500 beds, separate wings for contagious diseases, freshwater cistern, and rudimentary sanitation systems, a pharmacy that dispensed herbal and chemical remedies, training areas for surgical apprentices, record keeping, including patient registries and treatment logs. This was not just a hospital for soldiers. Civilians, poor locals, and foreign sailors were often treated. The rules remained clear. The sick, no matter their origin, were to be served with dignity. Visitors from across Europe marveled at the order, cleanliness, and scale of the infirmary. Some compared it favorably to institutions in Paris or Milan. In an age when hospitals were often chaotic and filthy, the Hospitaller complex stood apart. Science and faith in balance. By the 17th century, the order had incorporated early scientific thinking into its practices. The Enlightenment had not yet fully dawned, but the Hospitallers began to employ trained surgeons, not just monks, stock distillates, mercury, and opiates alongside traditional herbs, conduct autopsies in some cases, with permission from the church, publish and share medical treatises through their European network. Yet their practices remained deeply religious. The wards had altars, nurses prayed with patients, the sacraments were administered. The sick were not simply bodies, they were souls to be comforted, even when science could not heal them. This tension between medicine and ministry defined the Hospitallers throughout their history. They never fully became a secular hospital, but neither did they remain medieval in their approach. The decline of the Knights. Over time, however, the order began to lose its strategic and moral footing. Naval supremacy shifted to new powers: Spain, France, England. The Ottoman threat, once existential, began to recede. The order's wealth, privileges, and aristocratic membership drew criticism. By the late 18th century, the Knights were seen by many as an anachronism, a military religious order with no crusade to fight. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte seized Malta during his expedition to Egypt. The Knights, lacking the will to resist, surrendered. Their hospital was commandeered. The order was disbanded, at least officially. And yet again, it did not vanish. The afterlife of an order. Despite the loss of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller survived as a religious and charitable organization. Today, they exist in several forms. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, SMOM, a recognized sovereign entity headquartered in Rome, still operates worldwide. Their mission has returned fully to their origins, serving the sick, the poor, and the displaced. In modern times, they run hospitals, clinics, and disaster relief programs in over 120 countries. Their modern motto, Tuidio fide et obsequium pauperum, just as it was under Brother Gerard. No longer warriors, they are now diplomats, medics, and aid workers. The legacy of care. What remains of their medical legacy? The model of combining shelter, care, and prayer in a structured institution laid the groundwork for the first civic hospitals in Europe. Their multi-bed ward model, with ventilation and isolation spaces, prefigured the modern hospital design. Their rule-based training for medical staff would influence later standards for nurses and caregivers. Their international network showed how medicine could be shared across cultures, even in wartime. They were not physicians in the modern sense, but they practiced something enduring, ordered, compassionate care, scalable across regions and centuries. The quiet rooms beneath the flags. Today, the Sacra Infermeria in Valletta still stands. It no longer houses the sick, it is now a conference center and museum. But the main ward remains intact, stone arches soaring above, the floor polished by centuries of footsteps. The ghosts of caregivers linger there, not in chains of blood and battle, but in the whispers of healing. Visitors can walk its halls, just as the Hospitaller brothers once did. And in those moments, we're reminded that history is not only built by kings and warriors, but by those who carried bowls of broth, changed linens, whispered prayers, and cleaned wounds without expecting glory. A reflection across centuries. The story of the Hospitallers is not simple. It is filled with contradictions, swords and stethoscopes, humility and hubris, piety and politics. They fought, they healed, they endured. But perhaps their greatest legacy lies not in what they built, but in how they kept caring, even as the world around them changed. Hospitals today are noisy, complex, high-tech places, but they still operate on the same principles established behind the walls of Jerusalem nearly 1,000 years ago: care for the weak, discipline among the caregivers, and dignity for the dying. And somewhere beneath the fluorescent lights and antiseptic scents, that same quiet vow still echoes: to serve the poor as though they were Christ himself. Story 5. The Almshouses of London: Charity, Care, and Class. You walk along the winding lanes of 16th-century London, past the stench of river sludge, the bustle of fishmongers, and the cries of street sellers. It is not a city of splendor, not yet. It is cramped, smoke-choked, layered in soot and noise. But here and there, among the timbered shops and overhanging upper stories, a strange kind of building appears. A row of low houses, set back from the road, small but well kept, each with a tiny garden, leaded glass windows, and most unusually no locks on the doors. This is an almshouse, a place where the poor, the elderly, and the infirm are given shelter, not for wages or labor, but as a gift, or more precisely, as an act of Christian charity. Unlike the hospitals of the Crusades or the monastic infirmaries, almshouses were not about curing the sick. They were about providing a place to endure, to live, pray, and eventually die in peace. You knock softly. The door creaks open, but no one calls out. The resident is old, perhaps deaf, perhaps simply asleep. You step into a world that is neither grand nor tragic, just profoundly, quietly human. What is an almshouse? Almshouses, sometimes called hospitals, in early records emerged across England from the 10th century onward, though they flourished in earnest in late medieval and Tudor London. They were modest dwellings, often arranged in rows or quadrangles, where poor or elderly residents, often widows, disabled laborers, or former servants, could live rent-free, with modest provisions and spiritual care. Key features included: a small private room or cell, shared garden or courtyard, a chapel or prayer room nearby. Rules of behavior, often including daily prayers, sobriety, and quiet living. The goal was not rehabilitation or social reintegration, as modern social services might imagine. It was simply this: shelter for the deserving poor. But what made someone deserving? who was allowed to enter. Unlike the leper houses or plague hospitals, almshouses were selective. Entry was often governed by moral reputation, parish origin, and class standing. Typical residents were elderly widows or widowers, artisans too infirm to work, long-serving domestic workers or guild members, poor parishioners with a clean life and good character. Applicants were sometimes nominated by parish councils, guilds, or private benefactors. Many had to sign or recite oaths promising to live in quietness, godliness, and obedience to the rules of the house. Crucially, paupers, vagrants, and the criminalized poor were often excluded. Almshouses were not homeless shelters in the modern sense. They were more like early retirement homes, offered to those who had once belonged fully to society and had now, through no fault of their own, fallen into need. Charity and reputation. At the heart of almshouses was the idea of Christian charity, deeply tied to social status and salvation. Founders were usually wealthy merchants, guilds, clergy, or nobles seeking to demonstrate piety and earn spiritual merit. To establish an almshouse was to do a work of mercy, to shelter the stranger, clothe the naked, visit the sick. Many benefactors were explicit in their intent. They endowed almshouses in their wills and requested that the residents pray for their souls daily, attend mass or services in their name, keep anniversaries of their death. This created a mutual obligation. The founder offered housing, the resident offered prayers. In this way, almshouses were not purely about aid, they were spiritual investments, rooted in medieval ideas of purgatory, intercession, and the importance of ongoing remembrance. The structure of the almshouse. Early London almshouses varied in size and layout. Some key examples: St. Mary Magdalene's Hospital near Smithfield, a complex for elderly women run by Augustinian sisters. St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Though also a care center, it had attached almshouse dwellings for those too frail to return to work. The Mercers' Almshouses, sponsored by the powerful London Guild, housing former apprentices and their widows. Christ's Hospital, originally founded for orphans and poor children, but eventually took on elder care components. Buildings were often modest brick or timber framed, 1 or 2 rooms per unit, communal privies and shared gardens. Importantly, almshouses were typically placed within the city, not outside its walls like leper houses. Their visibility was part of their point, to remind passers-by of charity, mortality, and moral duty. The daily life within. A resident's day was quiet, structured, and spiritual. Morning, prayer or matins in a nearby chapel. Midday, a simple meal, often shared or cooked in rotation. Bread, ale, and pottage. Afternoon, light labor in the garden, mending clothes, reading if literate. Evening, vespers followed by early bed. Rules discouraged gossip, drinking, or sloth. Many almshouses imposed curfews or prohibited overnight guests. Some had a warden or matron who enforced discipline. Yet, despite their rules, almshouses were not prisons. Many residents reported a sense of community and dignity. For people who had worked all their lives, the almshouse offered something rare: shelter without shame. The shifting sands of the Reformation. In the early 16th century, this model came under threat. The English Reformation, beginning in the 1530s, brought about not just religious change, but the dissolution of monasteries and religious charities. Many almshouses had been founded by Catholic orders or linked to chantries funds, specifically used to pay for masses for the dead. When King Henry VIII and later Edward VI suppressed these institutions, many almshouses lost their funding. Some were sold off, others were abandoned. And yet not all vanished. Some were refounded by Protestant philanthropists. Others were taken over by parish authorities or trade guilds. The idea of caring for the respectable poor was too deeply ingrained to fully disappear, even as theology shifted. By the end of the 16th century, a new wave of almshouses less focused on prayer for the dead, more focused on civic charity began to emerge. London's rising merchant class played a key role in this evolution. A door that opens only once. An almshouse door was often a one-way threshold. Once inside, residents rarely left except through death. There was no rehabilitation, no social mobility. Entry was a final chapter, not a new beginning. And yet for many it was enough. A bed, a roof, a community, a name on a roll, a promise that, even in frailty, they would not be forgotten. A quiet kind of power. In a London obsessed with status and hierarchy, the almshouse offered a rare space where dignity could survive poverty. The difference between begging on the street and having a keyless room in a garden courtyard was not just physical, it was moral. To be in an almshouse meant that someone believed you still belonged. But what happened when those distinctions blurred? When poverty grew and deservingness became harder to judge? As London's population swelled and urban poverty deepened, could the almshouse model survive? The bells of London toll differently now. It is the mid-16th century. The monasteries are closed, stone crosses pulled down, Latin Mass replaced by the English prayer book. In this world reshaped by Protestant reform, the almshouse remains, but it is no longer the quiet Catholic refuge it once was. The changes are subtle at first. The daily prayers are shorter, the chaplain's role less central, the expectation to pray for the soul of the founder discarded. But over time, the transformation grows sharper. Almshouses no longer reflect just Christian charity but social discipline. They become places not just of shelter but of scrutiny, of sorting, managing, and defining poverty itself. In the shadows of Tudor palaces and merchant halls, almshouses now walk a line between compassion and control. The Reformation and the crisis of care. The dissolution of the monasteries, 1536–1541, ordered by Henry VIII, shattered England's traditional welfare infrastructure. Before this rupture, monastic institutions had provided much of the nation's care for the sick, poor, and elderly. They operated hospitals, almshouses, and gave out food daily. With their destruction, thousands were displaced, not only monks and nuns, but the beneficiaries of their care. In London alone, over a dozen religious hospitals and almshouses were dissolved. Their lands were sold, their chapels abandoned. Some residents were cast into the streets. This sudden vacuum forced new questions upon the city's leaders. Who now cares for the poor? How should charity be organized without monasteries? What separates the deserving from the idle poor? The almshouse, in its modest endurance, became a template for rebuilding England's charitable landscape. Only this time, it would be governed by civic ideals, not monastic ones. Civic charity and Protestant values. Under the reigns of Edward VI and Elizabeth I, charity was reshaped to reflect Protestant values: order, industriousness, and personal morality. Wealthy merchants and guilds increasingly took on the role of patrons. Almshouses were now founded not to earn prayers for the soul, but to demonstrate moral responsibility, civic pride, and godly discipline. Consider the merchant tailors' almshouses, rebuilt in the 1550s. Residents were selected from among the guild's aged members. They were required to attend Protestant services. Drinking, idleness, and profanity were strictly forbidden. They wore uniforms bearing the guild's crest. The message was clear: charity was conditional. It required decorum, faith, and gratitude. A similar ethos shaped the drapers', ironmongers', and fishmongers' almshouses, each a showcase of architectural symmetry, moral uprightness, and class boundaries maintained through charity. The rise of the deserving poor. In this new Protestant framework, poverty became moralized. The old idea that misfortune could happen to anyone, that suffering was a test of faith, gave way to a binary. The deserving poor, the elderly, disabled, long-serving workers or widows. The undeserving poor, the idle, the drunkard, the vagrant, the nonconforming. This division was reinforced by the Elizabethan Poor Laws, notably the 1601 Act for the Relief of the Poor, which required parishes to support their own poor, but also allowed them to punish sturdy beggars. In this climate, almshouses became a symbol of earned charity. They were reserved for the morally upright, often with years of labor, marriage, or church attendance behind them. Those who did not fit this mold, young, rootless, or rebellious, were often pushed toward workhouses, prisons, or exile. The open door of the almshouse now came with a gatekeeper's gaze. Architecture of order. Post-Reformation almshouses in London took on a new architectural language, symmetrical, clean, and visibly controlled. Rows of identical brick cottages. A central chapel or hall. Iron gates and boundary walls. Inscribed stone plaques honoring the benefactor. Take, for instance, Sir Thomas Gresham's almshouses in Bishopsgate, founded 1579. 8 tidy dwellings, a common garden, and stonework declaring the Christian duty of the founder. Similarly, the Charterhouse Almshouse, refounded in 1611, provided for poor gentlemen, elderly clerks, and scholars fallen on hard times, but still respectable. Even in care, class was etched in stone. Almshouses made a public statement that the rich could be merciful and that the poor could be virtuous if supervised. Life inside, rules and rituals. Daily life in these newly refounded almshouses retained some medieval rhythms, but added stricter oversight. Residents were expected to rise early, keep their rooms tidy, and attend chapel regularly. In some houses, bells were rung to mark waking, meals, and evening curfew. A master or matron enforced discipline and reported misbehavior. Violations, drunkenness, absence from prayer, disrespect could lead to expulsion. In return, residents received a small stipend, usually paid weekly, occasional coal or candles in winter, a set of clothing, often black or gray with simple trimming, a bed, washing basin, and sometimes a garden plot. There were no luxuries, but there was dignity so long as one followed the rules. Almshouses and the urban fabric. Unlike hospitals or monasteries, almshouses were embedded within the city. They were part of parish life. Their residents were seen, heard, and known. In an increasingly stratified London, this visibility mattered. It reminded citizens that poverty was not always shameful. It signaled that the city's elite still bore Christian responsibility. And it offered a form of gentle containment, keeping the poor visible, but managed. Even in this moralized version of care, almshouses often remained kind places. Residents formed friendships, cultivated small gardens, told stories, remembered old trades. They were not prisons, but they were not homes either, not entirely. Women and the almshouse. Women made up a significant portion of almshouse residents, especially widows. In a society where widows often lost legal and economic status, the almshouse was a rare place of female stability. Some houses were designed entirely for women, such as Lady Miko's almshouse in Stepney, founded in the 17th century for poor gentlewomen. The Lady Slaney Hospital for 12 elderly widows. Bridget's Hospital in Clerkenwell, where unmarried women were housed together under a female warden. Here, women found not only shelter but autonomy, a room of their own, small comforts, and a community of shared experience. Still, entry was limited to those with the right combination of character, connections, and reputation. The long shadow of class. By the late 17th century, almshouses had become a fixture of London's poor relief, admired by visitors and reproduced across England. Yet they also embodied attention. They offered real care, but only for a small, respectable few. They were Christian, but deeply tied to social hierarchy. They were charitable but reinforced class divisions through architecture, routine, and ritual. In essence, almshouses taught the poor how to be poor acceptably quietly, gratefully, obediently. But what of those who could not or would not conform? And so we ask, as London streets grew more crowded, its economy more volatile, and its poverty more visible, the almshouse alone could not answer the question of care. What happened when the respectable poor were no longer the exception but the majority, when need outpaced charity? Could almshouses scale, or were they relics of a smaller, slower city? The year is 1720. London hums with new energy. Stagecoaches rattle over cobbled streets. Coffee houses overflow with gossip and news. The Royal Exchange rises in stately pride, and the Thames is clogged with trade ships. The city is no longer medieval. It is mercantile, global, imperial. And yet along quiet lanes in Southwark, Clerkenwell, and Spitalfields the almshouses remain. Low brick rows, garden plots, iron gates with modest signs, founded for the relief of 12 poor women, a gift to the deserving poor by Thomas Walcott, merchant. These buildings whisper continuity in a world obsessed with change. They are relics but not irrelevant. They still serve, they still shelter, and they still reflect the deep ambivalence at the heart of English attitudes toward poverty and care. Almshouses in an industrializing city. As London entered the 18th and 19th centuries, its population exploded. The Industrial Revolution brought factories, railways, and mass urban poverty. The tidy, self-contained world of parish aid and guild-based relief crumbled under the weight of scale. But almshouses endured not because they could solve poverty, but because they were seen as symbols of civility, moral charity, and respectable legacy. In this era, almshouses became more architecturally refined Georgian in style, symmetrical, red brick with sash windows. Were increasingly gendered separate institutions for poor gentlewomen, widows, old sailors, or tradesmen. Were tied more directly to private philanthropy, especially by rising industrialists and middle-class benefactors. Were often placed on the edges of cities, where land was cheaper but connection to local parishes could be maintained. Residents now included former domestic workers, elderly spinsters, out-of-work craftsmen, decayed gentry living on the memory of a class long gone. These were not the desperately poor, they were the precariously respectable. A changing model of care. What made almshouses so enduring was their clarity. Unlike workhouses, they weren't punitive. Unlike hospitals, they weren't chaotic. Unlike the streets, they weren't lawless. They offered a middle ground, a place for people who didn't belong in the poorhouse, but couldn't afford rent. This made them appealing to both patrons and policymakers. For the wealthy, founding an almshouse meant creating a legacy, reinforcing moral order, demonstrating benevolence without surrendering control. For the state, almshouses were non-threatening. They reduced public visibility of genteel poverty without creating radical demands. Still, they faced critique. Reformers in the 1830s-1850, especially those behind the Poor Law reforms, saw almshouses as inefficient, anachronistic, and selective to the point of injustice. Why should a widow in Bethnal Green receive a garden cottage while another just as poor was turned away? Class boundaries carefully maintained. At the heart of the almshouse system was the idea that poverty was acceptable so long as it came with the right story. A man who had worked his whole life and fallen into hardship through no fault of his own, welcome. A woman of modest birth, pious and discreet with good references, welcome. A young man who had drifted, asked no permission, bore no letters of introduction, not welcome. A mother of 5, unmarried, known to have spoken out in church, not welcome. Thus, almshouses remained morally curated spaces. The comfort they offered was real, but so was the boundary they drew. Inside, piety, order, quiet. Outside, the unpredictable world of the poor. Life inside the walls. Despite these boundaries, life inside an almshouse was often deeply communal. Inmates, or residents, as they were later called, shared stories, celebrated feast days, helped each other in illness, and cultivated flowers or vegetables in the small garden plots. They became their own society, slow-paced, modest, shaped by shared routine. Letters and memoirs from the 19th century reveal a deep attachment to these spaces. One resident of an almshouse in Hackney wrote in 1854, "Though my means are small, my heart is quiet here. We have our bread and ale and no landlord knocking." For some, it was the first time in years they had security. Architecture as ideology. By the Victorian period, almshouse architecture had become almost formulaic. A central gatehouse bearing the benefactor's name, symmetrical rows of cottages, a small chapel or prayer room, neatly trimmed lawns, low hedges, iron railings. These were not random. They conveyed a message: order, modesty, and cleanliness. In this way, almshouses became moral landscapes, not just practical shelters. You did not just live in an almshouse, you inhabited a vision of who the poor should be. The 20th century and beyond. By the 20th century, almshouses were a small piece of a much larger care system. The rise of state pensions from 1908, council housing, the National Health Service, 1948, Social Security, meant that care for the elderly and poor became a matter of policy, not charity. Yet almshouses survived. Why? Because they offered more than support, they offered community. Today, hundreds of almshouses still operate in the UK. Some are medieval foundations. Others are Victorian restorations. Some are run by ancient guilds, others by modern trusts. Residents are chosen not for piety or prayers, but for need, background, and compatibility. Rules still apply. Quiet is expected. Community is encouraged. And while they no longer offer silver platters or daily prayers for dead benefactors, they still offer the one thing modern welfare often cannot: a door that opens without shame. From almshouses to assisted living. In modern terminology, almshouses resemble retirement communities, sheltered housing, independent living arrangements with communal support. But what they represent is older than any government program, a place of belonging after the world has moved past you. In this way, the almshouse stands not just as a historical institution, but as a moral question. How do we care for the elderly who no longer work? How do we define deserving in a world shaped by inequality? What does it mean to give care with dignity, not just with efficiency? A final reflection. You stand before an old almshouse in Southwark, 3 centuries of soot on the bricks, windows small but clean. The gate is unlocked. A cat dozes in the sun. A woman in a gray coat trims a rose bush. Inside, the walls remember. They remember pious founders and proud widows, weary craftsmen and whispered prayers. They remember centuries of debate about poverty, charity, and respect. And they ask a quiet question of us all. In the future we're building, will there still be a place for the poor who are quiet, who ask little, who simply want to be seen? Story 6. Birgitta's Vision, Medicine and Mysticism in Swedish Convents. It is the year 1341, and the chill of the Baltic clings to the skin like a second cloak. In the dim interior of a Swedish manor house, a woman kneels in prayer. Her name is Birgitta Bergerstotter, daughter of nobility, widow of a court official, mother of 8 children, and soon to become one of the most influential mystics of medieval Europe. At this moment she is silent. Her hands are clasped, her breath calm. But within her mind something stirs, a voice, clear and solemn. It speaks to her not in riddles but in revelations. It tells her that her task is not finished, that she must leave her household, her land, and her grief behind. She must go to Rome. She must speak with kings. She must write down the visions given to her. She must found a new order. And it will include a hospital, not just for the body but for the soul. Birgitta's early life, noble roots and spiritual restlessness. Birgitta was born in 1303 to an influential Swedish family. Her father, Birger Persson, was a provincial governor and lawman. Her mother, Ingeborg Bengtsdotter, came from a similarly powerful lineage. Birgitta was married young to Ulf Gudmarsson, a pious and respected nobleman. For decades, she lived the life expected of a noblewoman, managing estates, bearing children, accompanying her husband on religious pilgrimages. But within that quiet domestic life was a deepening spiritual intensity. From childhood, Birgitta had claimed to receive visions, not hazy dreams but vivid, specific encounters with Christ, the Virgin Mary, and saints. These revelations were often visceral, filled with bodily imagery, bleeding wounds, groaning martyrs, weeping virgins. Her God was not distant, he was suffering. And from that suffering came both insight and responsibility. The revelations, God's voice in the body in pain. Following her husband's death in 1344, Birgitta withdrew to a life of prayer and began recording what would become the Revelations, or Revelations, a massive collection of her visionary experiences, transcribed and edited by clerical supporters over the following decades. These writings combined apocalyptic warnings, political critiques, including rebukes to popes and kings, mystical theology, and notably, a theology of suffering and healing. For Birgitta, Christ's passion, his bleeding, torn, aching body, was not only the center of salvation, but the model for Christian care. Her visions described hospitals as places where the sick were not merely patients, but living icons of Christ. To touch the wounds of the poor, she wrote, was to touch the wounds of God. The conception of a new order. Amid these visions, Birgitta received what she believed was a divine mandate, to found a new religious community, the Order of the Most Holy Savior, later known as the Brigittines. This community would be unlike others. It would contain both men and women, though separated in practice, under the authority of an abbess. It would emphasize obedience, poverty, and hospitality. It would include a hospital, with rules for caring for the sick not only medically but spiritually. Birgitta wrote extensively about how this hospital should function. It should be attached to the monastery. It should care for both sick pilgrims and local poor. It should have dedicated nurses, women trained not just in herbs and remedies, but in prayer and moral counsel. The hospital must be a place of order, silence, and dignity, not a dumping ground for the abandoned. She envisioned a system where the suffering were central, not peripheral. Medicine in medieval Sweden, the world Birgitta inherited. To understand the impact of Birgitta's ideas, we must understand what passed for medical care in 14th century Sweden. This was a world of herbal remedies drawn from Germanic, Norse, and ecclesiastical traditions, healing springs and local saint shrines, monastic infirmaries, typically reserved for the monks themselves, folk healers and midwives, often female, often marginalized, a limited understanding of disease, focused on humoral imbalance, sin, and divine punishment. Most sick people were treated at home, or not at all. Hospitals were rare and often functioned more as shelters than places of healing. Into this landscape, Birgitta introduced a structured, theologically rooted, female-guided model of care, unusual even by continental standards, and radical in her native Sweden. Pilgrimage and pain, Birgitta in Rome. In 1349, Birgitta left Sweden for Rome, determined to win papal approval for her order. She never returned home. She spent the next 2 decades as a kind of spiritual ambassador, residing near the Vatican, speaking to cardinals, and offering unsolicited counsel to rulers across Europe. Her reputation grew. Some saw her as a prophetess, others as a nuisance, but few ignored her. She visited hospitals, shrines, and churches. She met the poor and the sick, and she refined her vision of what holy care should be. The sick should be housed in clean, quiet quarters. Nurses should see their work as a vocation, not just a duty. Spiritual guidance confession, communion final rites was as important as any poultice or potion. Women should be allowed to organize and supervise, care an unusual view in her time. She criticized institutions that treated the poor as burdens. True Christian service, she insisted, required tenderness, attention, and discipline. A vision waiting for home. While Birgitta would never see her order fully established in her lifetime, she planted the seeds. Her daughter, Katarina of Vadstena, and her supporters would carry forward her work. And at the heart of that work was the creation of a convent hospital, not an emergency ward, but a spiritual sanctuary for the weak, the weary, and the dying. It would take shape in Vadstena, on the shores of Lake Vättern in the coming decades. There, her vision would be tested, translated into architecture, ritual, and routine. But what would this convent hospital look like in practice? Who would care for the patients? What remedies would they use? And could a mystic's vision survive the grind of real-world disease? It is dawn in the small town of Vadstena, Sweden, sometime in the late 1370s. The lake is still. Thin clouds drift across the sky, carrying the chill of early spring. A bell tolls a soft, almost apologetic sound. It is not a summons to battle or a call to market. It is a signal that prayers will soon begin at Vadstena Abbey, the first convent of the Brigittine order. In the low building adjacent to the cloister, a long stone hall with shuttered windows and a sloping roof, a woman rises from her pallet. She is not a nun. She is a patient. Her legs ache with a sickness no one has named. A younger woman kneels beside her and touches her forehead with fingers still chilled from the basin outside. She offers no